Today's episode is brought to you by DeSanto Propane. DeSanto Propane is 4 generations strong as a trustworthy family-owned business with unmatched customer service. Go online at DeSantoPropane.com for more info or call toll-free at 1-800-752-4574. Since 1937, the difference has been DeSanto Propane. From FingerLakes1.com, this is the Debrief Podcast presented by DeSanto Propane. Josh Durso and Jackie Augustine here to talk all things Finger Lakes and local government. We have so many headlines to get to today, including the latest on Seneca Meadows Landfill, a report by Comptroller DiNapoli on casino performance across here upstate New York, and of course, your questions, which there were a plethora of, Jackie, after our first episode.
So exciting. I'm glad that people are sending questions. That makes it
Isn't that a little reassuring too? That
Definitely.
People aren't just completely fogged over with all this stuff?
Plugged in, paying attention to this stuff.
So let's start with your column. I believe it was July 25th, so it was like a week and a half ago, right?
Yeah.
About Geneva's low self-esteem. And I wanted to start there. One, because I thought the title of the column was pretty good.
Thanks.
But then also because I think it's a real issue, a real topic. That no matter what we're talking about here, it's one of those things that kind of seems to bubble up in every community. So my question for you is kind of like, for those who maybe didn't read it, it was in the Finger Lakes Times, if you want to go check it out. What got you there to that point of wanting to write that column? And then what was the reaction to it?
So I decided that this summer I was going to dedicate my summer columns to the comprehensive plan and just kind of reminding people that Geneva does have a plan for revitalization, for neighborhoods and economic development, and that if people would just trust in the data and the plan, that we could actually get some stuff done instead of the kind of chaos and stoppages that you've seen, where each meeting it seems like every counselor either doesn't know what's going on, totally unprepared, or is trying to advance something and can't get any support, or just all of a sudden pulls out of thin air some idea that he has that isn't grounded in reality, or ignores the fact that that very idea has been discussed and actually has a path forward if anyone cared to bother to look about it. So this particular article was about why there are sometimes so many bad decisions or lack of movement on things. And it really is, I think it goes back to the observation of the consultants that people in power in Geneva tend to always be telling a story about the city that doesn't track with the reality. And if the people in power in Geneva understood the real resources that the city had, the potential it has, then they would actually get to work capitalizing on that instead of just lamenting how bad everything is.
Yeah, and one of the things that stood out to me while I was reading it, I was thinking about our last conversation here, and about having some institutional knowledge carry over from one council or one governing body to the next. And the context or the picture that a comp plan paints is probably the first thing I think that gets lost when you have mass changeover in a village board, a town board, name the board, city council.
Right.
It doesn't matter. And that's probably the biggest challenge I think that any governing body would have in sticking to that, no matter who the personalities or who the people are that are in place. But at the same time, as I was having that thought process, like, I don't know how else that could be avoided without just having people who are genuinely interested in working within the context of the comp plan.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that Geneva's comp plan kind of envisioned that there would be an ongoing not that the steering committee from the comp plan would need to continue, but that there would be some engagement, that would be a living document and make its way into council discussions, that there might be a working group that's kind of keeping the city on track with that. And that didn't materialize. There are a couple of kind of administrative suggestions from the comp plan that didn't get put into practice. So over time, that institutional memory does get lost, which is kind of disappointing because, the current mayor has been in city government for a long time, saw the genesis of the comp plan. And I guess I was super optimistic when he ran that this was going to be the time to actually now put it into practice. But I don't know what happened.
Last comp plan to current comp plan, how many years between them? And what is the date of the most recent one? Is it within at least a few years?
Well, I think the most recent one is about 2018 that it was finally finalized.
Yeah.
But it's different than other comp plans. So some comp plans will give you kind of a picture in time and say, here are some projects to pursue. Yep. The Geneva comp plan said this needs to live longer. It needs to actually just be like a decision-making matrix. Like, we don't know what projects you're going to be faced with, but these are the principles to put in place however you do your decision-making. So it was pretty innovative in that regard, but, then quickly ignored.
Yeah, and it's, like I said, it's tough. I don't know what the mechanism would be other than there being some kind of force behind check-ins, periodic
Right.
check-ins on, city council or name the board should be held accountable to achieving the goals outlined in.
Ooh, you're giving me an idea. Maybe
So-
we need a report card. Maybe we need just here's what was supposed to be done. Here's what was actually done. We might need some remediation here.
Well, so listen, I see it and I read it all the time. And actually, I think just recently I read a report from either the comptroller's office or another state agency that looked at economic development agencies and basically said there needs to be more transparency and the methods maybe need to be revisited so that outcomes can be better. I don't really see how comp plans on a city, town, village level are that much different because you need it can't just be something that you recreate every decade and a half.
Right.
I think there would probably be a lot of people who would say that comp plan in Geneva probably isn't the most accurate thing at this point now anyway because of the pandemic, which would probably be the case in a lot of communities. A refresh would probably be necessary.
Yeah.
But that goes back to the living document point that you made. And at some point, there needing to be a bit of accountability built into how are they doing?
Right.
You know.
Right. And I mean, I think that's the good thing, at least about Geneva's existing comp plan, is that there are metrics in it. So you could go back, you could revisit those, you could adjust them as needed, and then that would show you what adjustments to the plan would need to follow.
Yeah.
But again, it takes people interested in actually doing the work of governing. And I think that's what we've seen is Geneva's fundamental problem, is that a lot of people who want to say they're in office and don't want to do the job.
Yeah, and it's a challenge. So let's talk a little bit about the biggest story of the week, maybe the biggest story of the entire summer when all's said and done here. Seneca Meadows has unveiled, along with Supervisor Farrar and the town board, a new proposed host agreement for if the DEC approves Seneca Meadows expansion request.
Yeah, that was a surprise.
Came out of left field. We had been hearing rumblings. So I'll say this: we had been hearing rumblings for the last several months that a deal was more or less there, like a framework existed, if you will. But I think there was a lot of confusion over when it would get put out into the public universe because of how murky this DEC process is.
Right.
So there was the town board meeting on Tuesday where the town did its part in unveiling what the what would be for the town, right? So $10 million a year, approximately. Total value of $173 million over the 15-year life of it. Odor complaint system, traffic getting routed away from Seneca Falls, for various parts of this process. Some kind of property value decline program, which I haven't had a chance to really get into yet. Local waste removal, free, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's unveiled Tuesday night. The next day, there's a protest and also the first public meeting that is essentially part of this DEC process at the rec center. And I thought the thing that was interesting, and we've got 3 reader questions, listener questions to answer as it pertains to this. But the thing that stood out to me is how absent the DEC appears to be. Like, Seneca Meadows ran that meeting, which is the first of 4. So I gathered from that session that there will be 4 of these kind of events that the DEC, it's part of the process for the DEC. But the DEC isn't exactly there. They're not exactly present. They're taking the information and they're taking the feedback, which I understand is largely digital at this point, a lot of written feedback. But just with the way this all came about and seemingly over the course of like a week or so, has put a lot of folks on their heels with this entire deal. Like they almost, talking to different people around town, the consensus somewhat feels like a decision has kind of been made.
Right. Everybody feels like, well, here is Seneca Meadows basically walking us through what they're going to do to us. That is, foregone conclusion. They feel like this is going to happen and they are going to attempt to placate people with certain payments and try to talk about this only in terms of positives. They are talking about an independent odor monitoring protocol, which again, though, will be selected by and seated with Seneca Meadows. So it can be called independent. The change then is that instead of Seneca Meadows employees directly investigating odor complaints, it will be Seneca Meadows contractors, which I guess they feel like is a step removed, but that's not really what independence means. So I don't know. I look at that and I just say, again, it goes to the self-esteem question, right? This landfill is polluting the land. It's polluting the air. It's not releasing like wonderful filtrated oxygen to us. Like we understand this is pay to play, right? They need to put these toxins somewhere. They want to put it in our backyard. They're just hoping we are desperate enough to take it. And they're just like, here are the bills. Do what we want. And for me, that feels very unsavory. And I think if to put, a finer point on it, if you were to think about it, about somebody's personal conduct, should we allow a person, a corporate entity, a village, a city, to be treated and abused in such a way just because the money keeps flowing in? I just fundamentally say no to that. But I do get this sense of resignation that people are like, well, maybe this is all we have to offer. We just sell ourselves. And
I will say that the opposing turnout was strong. I believe Peter Rantius reported between like 75 and 100 people. Don't quote me on that exact number. I'm not trying to estimate crowds here.
Right.
But the opposition was strong, I guess. To me, like I understand that Seneca Meadows is the one that's actually on the ground. They're the one that are actually doing it. And there's been all kinds of complaints about how Seneca Meadows has handled odors, how they handle the various kind of like quasi-political things that, become the kind of good neighbor slogan stuff. I get all that. But if I have beef with anybody in this process, it's the DEC and it's the state. Because and I'm just looking at this from the state's vantage point. I don't think New York State or the DEC wants to deal with figuring out where 60,000 tons of garbage is going to go if it's not going to Seneca Meadows, which is the fundamental question that would have to be answered in lieu of Seneca Meadows not getting an extended permit.
Right.
Right?
If not here, then where?
Where?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure there are other facilities across the state where it could kind of be dispersed to little in small chunks, but that's logistics and that's planning. And I don't think the DEC, frankly, has the manpower
Right.
or the interest in trying to figure that out. The state's solid waste plan is kind of just a farce to me. It feels like it's always just a lot of like platitudes and not a lot of actual like substance. Like,
Well, can I push back on that for just 1 second? And
Sure.
this is not to come to the defense of the DEC in this process, but I still want to tease out the fact that New York State's solid waste plan, or any municipality's solid waste plan, Ontario County's got a solid waste plan as well. That is a plan for dealing with the waste generated within those borders.
Right.
So New York State's solid waste plan probably does look a lot different than what Seneca Meadows' operation actually is. We are not taking exclusively New York State waste.
Yeah, of course.
So I understand, and I do wish the DEC had a more prominent active role in mediating some of this. But essentially, the DEC is now in the position of facilitating trash importation into and across New York State borders. And that is where I think the real tension is. Because if we were just talking about the DEC trying to manage a New York State solid waste plan with Seneca Meadows as a partner in that, the landscape would be a lot different, both metaphorically and physically, right? But we're talking about the business of trash importation. And to me, that's a different thing.
but New York City's the X factor there, to me anyway,
Sure.
because that's an in-state problem, New York City.
Agreed.
But it feels very much to the people who live in upstate New York like an out-of-state problem.
Yes. Okay.
So, like, to me, I don't know, and I agree with everything that you're saying. I just feel like this is going to be a very, like, so Liz asked us what the actual process is. That was one of the questions that popped up after this. So what is the actual process? Well, from what I understand, there's going to be 4 public meetings, and it appears as though they're all going to be administered by Seneca Meadows. The town will not be out, the town board does not appear to be obligated to be there. The DEC does not seem to be like it is going to have an active role in it. It will take the data that is collected from those events and render a decision. Will anybody in upstate New York or who lives in the Finger Lakes who is opposed Seneca Meadows expansion feel good about what the state did? The state's effort to protect the Finger Lakes and protect Seneca County and protect Seneca Falls from what Seneca Meadows will inevitably bring in if the permit is granted, if they don't actually see the DEC administering these sessions themselves.
Right.
It's a very strange, I was actually kind of surprised when it was explained that way to me, because it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, the burden's on the permit applicant to basically, jump through these hoops and gather this data. But I agree with you that that's not an ideal process, right? The process should require real community engagement and some kind of objective, moderated, or mediated series of discussions about pointed issues. So, if you want to talk about odor control, that needs to be its own discussion. If you want to talk about height, volume, import restrictions, whatever, that's its own discussion. But instead, this gets treated as expansion and everything is folded in. So any meeting could run the gamut. And when you're talking about everything, you're really talking about nothing, right? Because you can't drill down on the particulars if the meetings are just totally open-ended. We're just here to hear your concerns. So it's really a fundamental misstep of policy making that even if you take the position, well, this stuff has to go somewhere. So if it's going to come here, we might as well get the most out of it. Even if that's your position, it seems like you would want to have serious conversations about details and nuance and the actual particulars of the contract and the host agreement, instead of just an airing of grievances on one side and support and applause on the other, and these sound bites. We need to get into if this is going to happen, there needs to be a lot more substance-driven discussion about it.
Yeah, and a process that if it looks like a decision will probably be made at some point in the beginning of next year, like the first half of next year, that will feel like a very fast timeline between first meeting and then.
Right.
Another viewer question, Robert asked, on Wednesday afternoon, could Seneca Falls simply refuse the money? Yes. Like, there could not be a host community agreement, I guess. Like, unlikely.
Yeah.
Doesn't really seem like it would make sense. I think the big thing, and going back to what we just talked about, if we're talking about stuff that could or should or would, in theory, like set off alarm bells for the DEC to step in and be more engaged, is just the size of this host agreement. It's huge. $10 million a year compared to the 2 or 3 or 4 that, the town is getting now for no additional waste. Like, we're not talking about like the parameters, right, of how Seneca Meadows would be operating 2025 through 2040, 60,000 a day. Like, none of those things change. And yet the outcome for the town is that drastically different. That, to me, is something that the DEC, if they saw that number, they would say, oh, wait a second, maybe we need to be more engaged in this, or maybe there's something that needs to be looked at more carefully here.
Yeah, and I think, there are a lot of people who do spend some time looking through kind of corporate documentation behind the landfill operations. And it's clear, they have really well-paid executives and attorneys who are laughing all the way to the bank that they have gotten away this long paying this little. And if you think that what they're proposing to pay now is the maximum that they could afford to do it, well, you don't know anything about negotiations, right? They aren't coming in with their highest offer first. And yet, could Seneca Falls reject the money? Sure, but again, if they get the permit and they have to pay all this money, that's a win for Seneca Meadows. If they get the expansion permit and they don't pay the money, that's a double win for Seneca Meadows. So if you're looking for a way that the town takes a stand and gets something out of it, it has to be in the negotiation. And right now, there's been no public negotiation, as far as I can tell. The unveiling of this plan seems like there's been maybe a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiation, a lot of Seneca Meadows coming in with what they'd like, and the town just kind of nodding and saying, well, that sounds like a lot, great. But those negotiations need to be public, and they need to have input from people who have more expertise than just glazing over with the dollar signs, which is unfortunately what's been happening. People hear that money and they think, oh, my personal household, that'd be like winning the lottery. This is amazing. In the grand scheme of municipal operations, what are the town's plans for that money and for sustainability over time? Or are we just continuing to lock ourselves into the trash industry? Is that the economic development plan in perpetuity for this area?
Yeah, the last question that we had on this one was from Edward, and he asked how this impacts the election outcome, town supervisor, and you got a couple town board seats as well. I think this kind of clarifies everything, right, for people, that unlike in past years where landfilling was this sort of centerpiece because it was you're either for or against, it's going to be involved, but in a different way.
Right.
I don't think any of the candidates that I've heard from thus far are really opposed to a deal of some kind if the permit extension is granted. So I don't think it has a big impact on election outcomes. I think it's pretty much going to come down to can Supervisor Ferrara, as a down ballot candidate, be able to generate enough buzz to compete with the person who's now endorsed by the Democrats and Republicans. And that's kind of,
Yeah,
but I don't think it changes the impact. I don't think it changes the outcome of the deal. And I think that might be something that not a lot of voters are going to realize as they're carrying this out over the next couple months, is like, this is most likely the deal. Like, I don't think it's going to be higher or lower. You mentioned there not being a lot of public negotiations, there hasn't been, but clearly negotiations have been happening behind closed doors. And, $10 million a year is very close to like the town's total expenditures annually. So, to me, it feels a bit like a town of Seneca situation in Ontario County, where taxpayers in the town of Seneca Falls could very easily be almost netted zero on property taxes or town taxes. I'm not even sure how logistically you go from what the town's current property tax situation is to what it would be if that's what that money were being used for. But remember, the town has already been dinged a couple of times over the last, say, 5 to 6 years from state audits where they've held on to too much in reserves, and they've been warned, basically, you need to spend down. Well, all of a sudden, this pot of money that shows up every year, if the permit is granted, it's going to get even bigger. So the town's going to have to be thinking way more proactively about how they're spending it down and using it, not just on an occasional like capital upgrade.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's bad news in terms of approaching the election as though the Seneca Meadows expansion is a done deal. But it might, to be an optimist, because I try to be an optimist, although it hasn't sounded like it in this conversation, but I think now you do have some space, at least for this election, since there are two candidates, even if one, is on both ballot lines, to really talk about then what is a vision for this community reviving itself as a community, as opposed to just a host of a landfill. And that's going to, there's going to have to be discussions about, recreation and other value added, because let's say, what people might say, best case scenario, property taxes significantly diminished or goes away. So is home equity. Like the value of people's homes that they've invested in being located next to a mega landfill. Does that mean that people are now locked into their property? Do they have choices to leave if they want? Will anybody buy if they sell? So how do you make this community the best it can be in spite of hosting a mega landfill that maybe makes it unattractive for a variety of reasons in the future to potential investors in other sectors, right? And it comes, if you're a kind of one-trick pony, then is there anything else?
Yeah, I think the housing market is kind of its own bee's nest at the moment, right? Because it's not really representative of, a Seneca Falls problem. Does the landfill? I would push back on the notion right now, or in the next couple of years, barring some kind of actual like housing crisis in terms of just the market failing completely. I would push back on the idea that Seneca Meadows is inherently like diminishing property values or will be diminishing property values. There are so few houses going on the market everywhere that, going back to 2019 or 2020, we're like most counties across the region are at like 15 to 20% higher median sale price than they were then. And that trend is probably just going to continue because of the lack of housing. But to your point, how much new investment are you going to see in housing if the landfill is there? And will that kind of serve as a different kind of like squashing of that growth or that potential growth? Maybe not just sale of like properties that have existed already, but new. It's very interesting to me because this is a lot of money. And I think a lot of people will look at this as, well, this is great. This means we don't have to worry about like any existential issues, right? It kind of clears out, like the police department can continue existing as it exists. The water and sewer problems can be dealt with as they come up. We can probably add some different community services over the life of this with that amount of money coming in. But to your point, one trick pony also just kind of kicking the can down the road. Like every community outside of the cities that are in the Finger Lakes, I think have a series of existential crises that are playing out.
Right.
barring some kind of big investment or money from the sky kind of situation like this, there's that issue that we talked about before where like local government might be there might just be too much local government.
Mm-hmm.
Counties may need to take on some of that responsibility. This money kind of like would erase that.
It delays that. Yeah.
Yeah. And the frustrating thing for me is like, okay, you're delaying having to make the hard decisions again. Right. And it doesn't have anything to do with the landfill. I don't care if the money was coming from Del Lago. I don't care if the money was coming from anything. When you have like this giant pot of money that just fixes all your problems and you aren't fixing any of the core issues that create the problem, what are you doing?
Yep. No, I think that's an excellent point.
Speaking of casinos, since I just mentioned that, Comptroller DiNapoli released a report on how the upstate casinos are doing. And we've talked about casinos a bunch of times on the podcast over the life of the thing. But so the state's 4 licensed casinos brought in $176 million in tax revenue between 2017 and 2022 to local municipalities. That's not the total amount of money that they made. It's just what went to like Tyre and the other communities that host. DiNapoli said the goal of the report was to help communities avoid pitfalls that arise from, quote, misguided expectations. That's before, while they're being proposed. He also said casinos are not a, quote, magic fix, end quote, that solves local fiscal challenges. Again, don't think it's a silver bullet to your problems because it's not. And then revenues and tax contributions sat between 50 and 60% of initial expectations. So, wow, first of all, right? But we had a couple questions that came in. How should electeds or stakeholders approach revenue forecasts when receiving an economic development pitch? And I thought that was such an interesting question. That one came from Tony. I think he lives in Canandaigua or Geneva. I'm not sure, though. Interesting question because it's like one of the central pieces of like all of our conversations is around this like, here's this big giant economic development project and then just kind of nothing after it's built and nobody really checks up on it. The forecast is just kind of like maybe this inflated number that doesn't really hold water. So how should you've been involved in these kinds of, as an elected, you've been in these kinds of situations before. If you were kind of painting the perfect scenario for how you were going to, how a board was going to hear the pitch, analyze it, and then make a decision on it,
right,
what would it be? Like, what are the big pieces on that?
Well, my view on this, I'm sure, is not typical. But it goes back to this idea of the comp plan. It goes back to what you mentioned before about the discussion of the IDAs and other economic development initiatives across the state. That study that showed that some things are pretty out of alignment, especially around upstate and Finger Lakes. I think I don't want to say that people are really gullible, but a lot of local elected officials are really gullible, right? I mean, they look at this and they say, man, this guy says he's going to create all these jobs and we're going to get all this tax revenue. And they're celebrating before anything is even built. And I think that seems to be the caution that the comptroller is giving. Like, you can't rely 100%, at least, maybe not even 60%, on these projections, because there are a lot of factors out of your control. Now, in all fairness to the casinos, they will point to pandemic losses, right? Oh, yeah. But let's put that in context. If you're making a decision, no one would have foreseen the pandemic. Well, I won't say nobody, right? But on the local level, when people were talking about Del Lago, no one was thinking, well, how are we going to weather, worldwide pandemic? How are we going to deal with that? So the idea is that you have to always be rooted in your comp plan, the values and vision of your community, because you don't evaluate a project on the money. You evaluate a project on its value. Now, people would say that sounds like money. No, the value is about the quality of life value. If something is a good project for your community, then that can be supported. That can justify tax incentives, other kinds of assistance. because your community needs that project.
Yeah.
Because that project, if completed, will benefit your community. Usually when we get these inflated numbers and promises and then we don't meet projections, it's because someone's trying to do something the community doesn't need, but that for profit reasons, a company wants to put in your community.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when people really need to take a very skeptical look at these pro formas, because in some cases, you can line up the pro forma that's being submitted with what the state requirements are for the incentives, right?
Right.
It must create 60 jobs to reach this level. And all of a sudden they're saying, we will create 60 full-time equivalent jobs, not 61, not 58. We will be at 60. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is, I guess, is the advice. But time and time again, local boards don't take that advice. They buy it hook, line, and sinker, and then we end up ultimately either left in the lurch because we were counting on the money and it didn't come in, or worst case scenario, footing the bill to make up for some kind of civic investment that was made to make the project happen that then has to be repaid by the taxpayers and not by the new project.
Yeah, and I think that maybe is the issue that I think should be focused on more, right? Is the idea that don't just look at the revenue that can be generated. Look at you called it the value, but look at the needs.
Mm-hmm.
What does your community need? And that really is the answer. Now, what does that process look like within a governing body? I'm not sure, because one of the things that's really frustrating for me personally is just how complicated economic development or any kind of development is in, I think I'm on the Historic Preservation Commission in Webster, the village of Webster. And it's kind of like an extension of the Zoning and Planning Board, which serves at the pleasure of the village board.
Right.
And it's for anyone who wants to do anything significant, there are these steps, these weird steps, and you've got all of these different, and when you're talking about a big economic development project, we're going to talk about Micron here in a couple of minutes, but that's a good example too. You've got town planning boards involved, you've got town boards involved, you've got county planning board involved, you've got county board involved, you've got economic development agents, IDAs involved.
Right.
You have all of these different entities, all of these different people, and a process that feels a lot like you're checkerboarding going back and forth, right?
Right.
So this body has to say this, then this body has to, and you lose people. And I think a lot of times when you're talking about local elected officials, even if they have the best of intentions, I think through a process that ends up taking months and months and months and comes to them and leaves them and comes to them and leaves them, they get foggy on what they actually are looking at. And it's hard to take a critical look at something when there are so many moving parts and so many different people involved. I'm not saying it should be one body rule, but I think if you're going to fix the existing problem that we have with economic development, it is trying somehow to create more of a inside the ropes kind of approach to how much value does this add? What's the value of this thing in terms of monetary kickback to the community? And then also, to some degree, I think there has to be market analysis done by the communities themselves.
Absolutely.
How much fact check them, basically, right? Fact check the developers, but I'm not even sure that does that exist in local government?
No. I mean, an excellent example, many years ago when I was on city council, someone came to us with a proposal and it looked too good to be true. Mm-hmm. And this was back in the early days of Google, right? To date myself. And I Googled this particular firm, and it turns out none of what they were proposing or their portfolio of prior projects was actually accurate. And turns out this was a phony thing. But why did they put that forward? Because if they could show that they had secured this piece of property that gives them equity and leverage for back what they were going to do. They were from New York City, to be able to have that portfolio. And I think people were so shocked that someone would lie to us, which I usually am too. I'm a trusting person. I don't like being lied to. But it's that old adage that Chip Capero, he and I were on council at the same time, used to say, which obviously is not his, it has its own political background, but trust but verify. And that's what local elected officials are supposed to do. They're supposed to be welcoming, they're supposed to be encouraging of development, but they need to do the homework and check things. And you see what's happening in Geneva right now at the last council meeting. I mean, the planning board can't get a quorum. It has too many members, I guess, under state law. They haven't conducted the required annual training. Their liaison has almost never attended. Now he says, well, he has lacrosse. Okay, maybe I'm old school, although these guys are all older than I am, so it's not a generational thing, but maybe it's just a mindset. If your job is to be somewhere and you can't be there, you either find someone else to fill in for you because you have a conflict, or you say, I'm sorry, I'm not the right person for that job, which is so important. The planning board is like so important. And in Geneva, it gets treated just like, well, here are some friends that we know, we're going to appoint them to the board. Doesn't matter if they show up, doesn't matter if they comply with the law, doesn't matter if they do the training. They're nice. And then we wonder how we end up with projects that don't meet their projections, that don't serve the community, that get built or not in ways that weren't expected. It's because people have to take these jobs seriously, and it's not just. I guess that's my overall point of the day, right? You're not serving. You're not being a public servant to serve your ego. Like, there's work to be done. And if you can't take it seriously, you might not be the right person for the job.
Yeah. And again, these projects, when they're in talks, a couple years, roughly, right. Usually, using Del Lago as an example here, a couple years, then the building, constructing, that takes a couple years. Right. Then it really takes probably I would say 5 years to see once it's operating, what it's really going to bring. You're talking about a decade, basically.
And there's a lot of turnover in that time.
So much turnover, and just the energy right. that's required to stay engaged from the beginning to the end, and then verify right. that everything checked out, and then hold accountable whoever needs to be held accountable. Trevor wrote and said, what about all the job development, economic development and growth that was supposed to happen in Tyre?
Right.
I remember the town putting out, and I think we're now two administrations removed from the administration that ultimately made that decision. But I remember the plan, the actual plans of neighborhoods right. and strip malls and different economic development out in Tyre, and that it never materialized. Those documents are still online, by the way. Look them up if you want a good laugh, I guess.
Yeah, but imagine a community where when elected officials left office, they transferred, going back to that question about institutional memory, right? Mm-hmm. They transferred the knowledge that they have about these projects to the next group, that they actually felt some responsibility to the community to have continuity of information and to hold people accountable. In Geneva, Wilmerite, their expansion, the city was supposed to get a lot more benefit from that. Well, a whole new group came in, and that kind of got forgotten. And some of us talk about it, and given political affiliation, someone can't listen to somebody else. And, we're our own worst enemy if we're not all rowing in the same direction here. It's not about, these are not partisan questions. If a project is in action, then the information about that project, about the promises made, obviously I would say get it in writing first. That would help. But still, if you don't think that these larger corporations know how small towns work and know how to capitalize on that, then I'm sorry. I think that is a gullible position, right? They know what they're doing. We need to start knowing what we're doing.
And to that end, using Del Lago as an example, 3 owners, 3 different owners over the life of 2016 to present day. That's,
Right.
I
Has
mean,
there been a meeting at each step to say, these were the promises, here are our expectations, here's where things are failing. Tell us now, new owner, how you're going to make good on some of this.
and it turns
Maybe.
into
Has that happened?
take it or leave it.
Right.
Right. Like
Right.
take it or leave it. And they're there, so you can't really leave it. It's just,
Right.
take it. Another economic development question. Bill from Aurora wrote, I live in Aurora and keep hearing about all the positives of Micron choosing CNY as its destination. The main development will be in the Syracuse area. Do either of you think the economic impact will really spill over into the rest of central New York like Cayuga County as state and federal leaders have promised? No.
See, I don't know. Now here, let me go. I don't know if the agreement has tied into it certain types of performance measures for where recruitment for some of the high-tech positions will happen, if there are connections with school districts in terms of pipelines for workforce. I will say a project that is that high-tech and has that a need for that much kind of human capital is going to have done some research to actually make sure that there is a pipeline of workers. That's kind of one of our limiting factors, right? For certain industries, we simply don't have workers to fill positions for certain types of industries right now. And that's something that, perpetually these communities need to keep working on. But I do think if you're talking about tech sector workers and decent salaries, if they're held to account that the payment metrics are there, then you would see people choosing to locate in some of these desirable Finger Lakes communities where the commute's not too difficult, but the quality of life is high, if we can maintain that. So I'm more optimistic about economic development from that project, given the type of industry and the salary range.
Yeah, so I guess I'm thinking of it from more of like the how will the communities develop versus just like the will people from Cayuga County work for
Right.
Micron or affiliates. I guess like that part of it I agree with. I think that your assessment's spot on. I guess when I hear people ask this question, I feel like it's baked in like, is Aurora going to look different because of Micron choosing Central New York? And I think the answer is no. And I think that's where people tend to like, when they think about, people tend to center themselves, right? And when an entire region is painted as this winner
Right.
of an economic development project, I think there are parts of the region who will feel like nothing ever happened.
Right.
And I think it will benefit the entire region, of course. And your point is, like I said, I agree, spot on. But like when I just think about the promise and how it's kind of presented,
Yeah.
I feel like there's a little bit of setup for disappointment.
Well, I hate to go back to the comp plan again. No, I don't. I love the comp. I would just let's just talk about the comp plan all day. But I would just say that, the consultants who did the comp plan had really good insight into how workers in certain types of industries do change their community. So, for example, and I don't want this to come off the wrong way at all, but if we are attracting a certain heavy industry with assembly line workers, the expectations that a group of assembly line workers might have for community amenities is group A, right? And there might be many communities that meet that group. If we are talking about tech workers who might be coming here from other communities in other parts of the country where amenities are at level A+ or A++, right? Then that does force the communities where they settle to kind of step up their game. It's a reciprocal thing. Both initially, the workers are going to be attracted to communities that have those amenities, but then the workers themselves are more likely to participate in creating, developing, maintaining those higher level amenities than the community right now might have the capacity for. So I am more optimistic with that type of employer. But that's not to say anything about other employers. I just.
That's a great point, though. That is a really good point. Kind of like all ships rise with the tide situation.
Right. And that's the idea. The idea is that, you're bringing in people who not only expect more, but are willing to do more to make those expectations real. And that does change a community over time if you have a critical mass of that.
So another question we got kind of on this community service level. Allison wrote to ask, from local to state police, agencies are having trouble recruiting. What should communities, big and small, be doing to address this or concerns residents might have about public safety? Interesting, because I think a lot of communities need to start looking outside the box on how to address public safety concerns, because the talent pool just isn't there. I have a lot of friends who work in law enforcement or have worked in law enforcement, even some of them younger, and they just don't see a lot of other people, right? Like, there just aren't a ton of people seeking out these jobs anymore. And I think that has, state police is kind of an animal of its own. But I think when you're talking about city police departments, village police departments, county sheriff's offices, sheriff's departments, the pitch becomes very difficult for getting and then retaining employees. And that's just kind of like a fundamental worker dynamic, I guess. Doesn't really have as much to me to do with policing or the attitudes toward policing. I think that's just kind of like, for the type of work that it is, the dollars just don't math anymore.
Well, I agree with you that for the type of work, but I do think it has something to do with policing. Right now, I mean, look at emergency services in general, right? If we look at EMS or we look at fire departments, there are fire drivers, there are, everybody kind of has a job. People know when they show up, this is what they are going to be doing. So that gives people reassurance. They know what they're getting into. They can make that decision. Is this going to pay me enough or not? I'm talking about, professional firefighters as opposed to just volunteer. But then in policing, let's set the state police aside, because I do think that they have a lot more of this figured out. But when we look at counties, cities, towns, the police are called on for everything. One day you could be just checking the doors of a business. The other day, or in the same day, or 15 minutes later, you're responding to a burglary. Then 30 minutes later, domestic violence. 30 minutes later, mental health. Like, how do you explain to somebody that that's an attractive job, that you need to have every skill set under the sun to do well and to feel safe in and to feel predictable and secure, that this is the job I signed up for, that I'm going to do for this salary? And anytime you try to have this conversation, right, you get some people who say don't say a word about the police if you're not one. Okay. I also have, although they'll never admit it, I also have friends who are police officers, but you can, if anybody's listening to the police officers, they're also saying there's stuff out here we can't handle, right? And that's not a failure on their part. It is the fact that as communities, we've not defined what we're expecting from our police departments. We're asking them to be a jack of all trades. And I think if communities could actually have reasonable, non-emotional discussions about what public safety really means and what the best strategy would be to meeting these various needs that currently comprise a police officer's day, I don't think you'd have trouble recruiting police officers if they knew this is what the job is, and I'm going to have resources and supports for the things that are not the job.
Yeah.
But no one will have that conversation. I'm optimistic, right? Geneva has a new police chief. For people who saw that process, talk about a transparent process in terms of interviews and stuff, that's unheard of. So kudos to the city manager for doing that and for the candidates for participating in it. But, it could be a new day in Geneva, moving towards some of what Seneca Falls is already doing in terms of having more crisis intervention services and understanding that is a need. It's okay to say the police can't or shouldn't be doing X. Somebody else needs to do that.
Everybody, whether you're an elected official or just a casual taxpayer or not, you just live in a community. There's a limit to how much bandwidth you have as a person to be able to have these conversations. And I think too much of it over the last, say, like 5 to 6-ish years has revolved around police or no police.
Right.
And not enough of it has been about, okay, how do we deal with all of these different problems? Because what you're describing are like a half dozen different problems that a police officer might have to engage with in one shift.
Right.
And that's kind of like, with that conversation, yes, police, no police, taking up so much of the air, it's very difficult to have a meaningful conversation like what you're describing about, okay, what are the actual expectations we have of our police officers? Is what we're offering like competitive? Does it make sense? Would anybody want to do this job? And I think because of that, the answer has become no in most communities for the would-be applicants, the people who would come out for these jobs. And the thing that we see is just this debate around should there be police or no police.
Right.
Where it's just far more complicated than that. Last question comes from Maddie in Canandaigua, who read a story last week about a 134 housing unit project in Canandaigua. She says, have to admit, reading the feedback on social from the community was disheartening, a lot of negativity. Why does this always seem to be the case? What's happened that we can't get behind or support anything that looks like a net positive for the community? So I think most of the negative feedback was from a couple of Facebook groups, ironically enough, where it's just kind of like weird social media debates happen about things that happen in the community. And then you show up to the meeting, the actual municipal meeting on this topic or whatever it is, and nobody's there. And you're like, wait, I thought there was all this negativity around this thing. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where I sit with it. I don't think it's quote unquote real. It just feels to me like there's a lot of like naysayers whenever something is proposed, whether there's merit to it or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like, it's that gloomy thing that you were talking about in the beginning of the show, where it's just kind of like the low self-esteem.
Yep.
And, I'm not really sure how, like, what else there is to that other than just, I think we have a lot of people who, like, their basic needs aren't being met and they feel like they're being, like, crushed in the system.
I know, it's funny. I mean,
and that's just like, it's presenting itself in all of these debates.
Yeah.
All of them.
I mean, I guess it's actually sad. I mean, certainly Geneva is not immune to that. In fact, it's a case study. And I stay out of Facebook debates because half the time, first of all, people are talking about stuff that it's like if you took the time to correct the factual inaccuracies, you'd never do anything else the rest of the day. But then it's like, okay, well, there have been 10 meetings about this that you didn't come to. And now you're saying, oh, this got shoved down our throat. I'm thinking about like 5 and 20 redevelopment downtown issues in Geneva. Whether you like it or not, the allegation that no one knew about it is like, no, only people who only talk about stuff online on social media and aren't actually engaged in the community didn't know about it. And I understand it's on governments to get that information out. It's on the developers of these projects to get good information out to people. But I don't put a lot of credence. I don't put a lot of weight on people who complain about stuff on Facebook because they're not going to come to a meeting. And it's like if you could which is sad because there are probably legitimate concerns in some of those posts that could make themselves into part of the policy discussion, but people won't take the time to even write. I mean, I'm not saying you have to show up physically in a meeting. I understand a lot of people don't have time for that, right? But if you, instead of posting something to a Facebook group, sent an email to the actual city manager or, an elected official, then that would be heard, or it should be heard. But yeah, it's hard for me to get caught up in Facebook squabbles because I think people are just bored.
Yeah, I don't know how much of it is like, I think there's a percentage of it that's just people being bored and maybe a little bitter.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I feel like kind of it also goes back to what percentage of the population has its basic needs fully met. And a lot of I'll use the Finger Lakes One Facebook page as an example. Like, there are a lot of times when I will occasionally read through the comments. I don't do it a lot.
Well, you have to. That's your job.
Like, occasionally I will read through the comments, and because I grew up in this community, like, I know the names, I know the people, and this isn't to like point at anybody, but you're able to understand like their situations more because you're from the same community. And when people's basic needs are not being met, they say and do things that just don't align with reality, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, and don't seem logical and maybe it's because they're working 3 jobs and they feel like they're just not making it. Right. Or maybe it's because they are dead afraid of their property taxes going up anymore, because if their mortgage goes up $150, they're not going to be able to feed their kid. Like, there are so many fundamental broken things in our system that I think it pretty much creates this baseline of negativity whenever something that elected leaders try to tout as a positive. The instant reaction is to pull it down because I'm not being pulled up.
Right.
And that's just kind of like that's a flaw. Like, that's just not a flaw in the person. That's a flaw in the system. And until that happens, I think to this reader's point, I think it's just going to keep happening. I think you're always going to see it as long as we have, what is it, like 58 or 60% of the American population living paycheck to paycheck and like a $400 expense away from like bankruptcy or whatever the ridiculous stats are on that. Like, that is not sustainable.
No.
That is going to create a population, frankly, that hates each other.
Well, that's what's happening. And what's sad is that you're right. And I have a lot of compassion for that. People are afraid. They're afraid for their families. They're afraid for themselves. They're afraid for the future that they're hoping that they can be part of. And what's unfortunate is that, and I'm hoping Geneva's elections don't go this way, but so far it's not shaping up positively. We saw it in the primary. I think when it comes to elections, when it comes to local politics, there are some people who use that fear and want to feed on it and use it to their advantage, and pit people against and make it look like we're being taken over, our heritage is at risk. And then there are people who are like, wait a second, let's try to let cooler heads prevail and think, how can we, like you said, meet the needs that you feel aren't being met? How can we do a better job of making sure that whatever we're doing isn't leaving people behind, isn't cutting people out? And I guess my hope, and that's why you said that my column before we started, you said that my column was hit an optimistic note, even though it was about Geneva's low self-esteem. And I appreciate you saying that, because I do want to remain optimistic. I think at the end of the day, people's better angels will win out, right? I think ultimately people can get past that fear and can move forward and embrace a little bit of change and see how things are going to go, and maybe start to trust their neighbors' intentions sometimes, instead of just all this finger pointing and scare tactics. And it's just,
Achievable.
I have hope for us. I think people come and visit the Finger Lakes and they think we're great, and we just need to like listen and accept that for once and say thank you instead of giving them a reason of why they're wrong and things are terrible.
That is a very good spot to end the show right there. Next time we do the show, we'll get into the races that are coming up this fall.
Okay.
I think it's probably better to let people know about what contested races are coming, maybe in August instead of on November 1st.
Right.
But that will do it for this edition of the Debrief. We will be back in a couple weeks with another episode. In the meantime, follow us on social for the latest headlines or download the fingerlakes1.com app for breaking news alerts throughout the day. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.